I love black people, and I wanted to start this video with this fact because it's actually been a very long and arduous trip for me to love black people. I can say that fortunately I've loved black people my whole life, but black people have not always loved me. We talk about black hair in some of my videos, and I've always been sort of in many ways outside of the black people that I'm around, and I'll explain a bit of that later. But I've always, been on the margins of the margins, as I call it, to see how the loathing that I sometimes feel from black people, I also see that directed towards other black people for other reasons, and for me it really comes down to a great deal of self-loathing that we have. So we were talking about Afrocentricity or Afroconsciousness earlier, and I'm a person of Nigerian and Black American descent, and I grew up in the South, and so my mother in particular has always surrounded me with so-called Afrocentric people. I was in dance classes from the time that I practically could walk, from tap dance to ballet, African, modern, jazz, everything. Of course, I was one of the kids in the 80s who was learning, the moves to Thriller and Michael Jackson's video, but we also did, different forms of contemporary dance, not contemporary African dance, that was more traditional, and also drumming. We made our costumes, and to do all these things and perform these things in front of audiences, we had to really have a sense of the rootedness of the action of valorizing this particular art form, African-centered art, African-based arts, particularly dance and music. And so it's interesting because through that, being on the margins of loving African and black people, but not just as sort of the commodity that our culture presents to us, but it's my family. I've always known that Africa was a place with people. The most famous African for a lot of people is Tarzan, and for me, that's never been a question. That's always been the other. But I've always understood that we had that kind of colonial gaze at us as Africans, and so it was easy to translate into the colonial gaze of the hegemonic culture in America towards us as African Americans. And so it was always very easy, and very early I could see that loving black people was a form of resistance, and that resistance really was met with itself a lot of resistance. There is a reason why we don't see permed hair, we don't see nappy hair all around in our popular images. It's not that people don't have the ability to make choices, but when we talk about informed choices, those choices are not informed. They're informed by a culture that says that there is one way to look, like one pop diva. Have you noticed that Christina Aguilera, Britney Spears, Madonna, J-Lo, of course Beyonce, half a dozen other divas, they practically, Shakira, they look like the same person. Vanessa Williams, to be a person of color and popular, it's like you have to look like the exotic mulatto. And so it's not as if we have informed choices. Our choices are informed by a white, supremacist, patriarchal, capitalist view. I didn't make that up. That comes from Bell Hooks. I hope you people read her. If you don't read her, you can see her videos on YouTube. Look it up. And so I was saying that for me, I love black people. And yet I've always recognized that there was something about loving black people that, one, may not have been reciprocated. Being the effeminate person, it's mostly black people who have been openly homophobic to me my whole life, from children to adults. I remember in one program that I was in 7th grade, there was one of these summer programs for urban youth to introduce them to college and university, and I love programs like that. But we had one speaker, one prominent African American leader in the community, who was talking about some speech that he gave, and then at the end of his speech, there was a very effeminate African American man who came up to him and said, thank you for your speech, I really appreciate your work in civil rights, blah, blah, blah. And this man, as he reported this in front of a group of students, he mocked him. He started doing all the lisp and the swishy walk, and saying that it was those kinds of people that were hurting the black community. And I thought, this is hate speech, and yet I'm the only one in the room that recognizes it. There's silence. And then another student whispered under his breath, with whispering, loud talking memes, look, you're talking to one right now, one of those fags. So here I am in this summer program where black people are being taught to love themselves, and everyone colludes into this hate. Everyone colludes into this hate. That is one example, and I'm 32 years old, so trust me, I have a lot of such examples. And from being called trade in a lime green shirt in New Orleans by some 16, 17-year-old punks who couldn't come out themselves, or by some 17-year-old girl in the same city. All black people. So when I say that I love black people, I love how we look, how we act, how we move, how we think. I love the jazz way of doing things, the ability to really contribute as a group to an effort. But each person can shine. I love the blues ethic. It's a much better ethic for me than the Mo Money ethic. I love black people. And for me, you can't really separate who we are from our music and other cultural expressions that we have, which is why I'm listening to Stevie Wonder right now. And this album came out when I was 2, and my mother famously says it is the single most important aspect of her life at that time that helped her get through my terrible 2s. So it's no wonder that I love black music, and that I've studied black culture, that I teach a class about black music and black dance. But when it comes to Afrocentricity, I also recognize that as African Americans, we can romanticize Africa, and I've gotten to a lot of trouble because I even once called it exotify Africa on the part of African Americans. And so it's a very narrow line, and I know that my cousins back in Nigeria, one of them said when Beyonce came, she was like, I'm happy to be back home and back in Africa. And of course, she is not from Africa. Beyonce, she's not in any way able to trace her African roots, and so for her to say she's back home when she's in Nigeria is really comical to a lot of Nigerians. But I tried to explain to my cousins that, look, we're really searching for something, for a rootedness, and there's an obvious connectedness that we feel because it's just evident in all of the cultural expressions throughout the diaspora that we are all deeply rooted in African culture. And it's very beautiful, but we don't take it any further than that. We don't even go to Africa. We don't even think about what does an African person look like. Even to sit and to think about what is African beauty outside of a dominant, white supremacist, capitalist, patriarchal hegemony. Like, what does that look like? And I don't claim to have the answers, but I do claim to meditate on it, to give some serious thought to the fact that my people were, half of my people, ones in Nigeria, some of them colluded in selling slaves to Europeans, and the other half of my people are the descendants of that transatlantic slave drive. So our karma is really mixed, and to come to terms with that, I'm really happy that we continue to just express ourselves incessantly, and that music and dance, are a part of that, a very strong part of that, because Africa did give the world the beat, the drum, the African drum, and it is our gift to the world, and it's one that I think that the world, I wish the world would reflect more back to us. At this point, I do feel like everywhere I go, black people, Africans are like damn underdogs, and this is something I will talk about in the future.